Hi, everyone. We're going to keep this moving right along. Thank you so much. I'm Maggie Lake. I'm with CNN. I anchor a show in the 9 a.m. hour right around the U.S. Open for CNN International called CNN Money. And we're here today to talk about sustainability. And I'm joined by two fantastic, very talented women. Bea Perez. Bea is the first sustainability chief for Coca-Cola, and also Dina Powell. Dina leads Goldman Sachs impact investing business, which creates market-based opportunities and solutions to drive sustainable economic development. So to kick things off, one thing I hear all the time when I'm reporting on this and covering it in our shows, when you're talking about sustainable development, is that it can't be done by just one segment of society. You need to have corporations, government, and the private sector all working together if you're going to scale up and meet the challenges that are ahead of us. So I'd like to start the conversation on that point if we can. And Bea, I'm going to start with you because you're doing so much work on the ground with this. When we look at climate, we know that's been a big issue in water, sustainable agriculture. This really went from being an environmental issue when you're talking about it at a corporate board level, yes, for a long time it was, to really now being a business critical one. Can you walk us through that transition for Coke?
Sure. And I guess some people call it the stress nexus, and it's not just stress for communities, but it's also stress for business. If you think about what business we're in, which is beverages, you can see the number one ingredient in here is water. The number one ingredient here is water. We have 3,500 beverages. So when a community is in stress with water, so is our business, and it's under pressure. And so in about 2011 was when Muhtar Khan, our chairman and CEO, said, we've been doing a lot of work around water, and some of it's been philanthropy through our foundation. Some of it has been through the business through other partnerships. But what we have to do is set goals and commitments, align them with our business, and measure and track them the same way we do with our current business and everything that our business unit presidents are held accountable for. So he pulled me out of the North American business. I had been in field operations, I'd been in brand management, and I had been our chief marketing officer. And so he said, I want you to apply the same discipline you did in that half of the house. And what I found was really great, because at that point in time when I came in, we already had several hundred projects happening around the world. Very local, community-based. But what I also found is that if someone said to me, how well are they working? What's your water efficiency number? How much water are you replenishing? It was very difficult to secure the data. Or it was self-reported and I didn't have the confidence to talk about it. So we went through about 1 year of analysis, working with the business unit presidents, setting clear goals and commitments. We set a goal to replenish 100% of the water we use, including in the manufacturing of our beverages. And then we broke that down into, reducing the amount we use, recycling water within our operations, and then replenishing through partnerships like the WWF or USAID or Bill and Melinda Gates, so across the communities. By setting those goals and commitments and annualized targets with our division presidents, all of a sudden the field operations became more accountable, and it became part of a rewards and consequences framework. And we saw the numbers accelerate. Just last year, we publicly reported that we're 94% of that 100% number. The target is for 2020. So some people applaud us and say, great, you've accelerated, you're ahead, almost 5 years ahead of where you thought you'd be. I'd get nervous because to me, as you know, in business, when you're doing well, that means that you have to do more to keep doing well, and that requires more partnerships. Partnerships with the local governments, partnerships with the local community, partnerships across implementation to ensure that what we were able to do to get to the 94%, we can repeat and scale and do more of, and that we won't fall backwards. And we see that the pressure in water is not going away. And also, if it is about the business, as you grow the amount of product you sell, that means you do need to step up and do more in water because your bar just went higher. But I have found that then assuring the data through E&Y, so taking a very disciplined approach, set the target, make sure you define the target, set annualized targets across your business where the business unit presidents are held accountable, then measure and track, but assure the data through auditing firms or accounting partners, and we do it today through E&Y, I have found has created a very serious discussion where the business unit presidents don't look at this as philanthropy. They look at it as core to the business operations, and they take the accountability very personally.
Which is a huge sea change. I think it makes all the difference when you're talking about this, and especially getting buy-in from the very top of the company. I'm going to scooch my chair so I can actually see Dina, but that's okay. Dina, I want to pick up on that. So Bea just said it makes her nervous, rightly so, and that you need more partnerships to do that. One of the things I hear repeatedly is, in order to start to really move and scale, those partnerships, which a lot of times you mentioned a lot of NGOs or organizations that have been long on the ground with this, the missing piece is private funding, private sector money. You say you're seeing a shift in a similar way away from philanthropy toward investing or impact investing. What are you seeing at Goldman, and how can that fill that need?
Well, I think I'll pick up on a lot of the great points that Bea made. I think that first and foremost, if you want to attract private investing in some of the initiatives you're building, you really have to have a great expertise. It has to be aligned with your business mission. So it's obvious why the work that Bea is doing and Coca-Cola is doing around water is central to their mission. In our case, you know, we grow as a company if GDP around the world grows. And we were actually able to make an economic case that economically empowering women, particularly in emerging economies, would not only lift the GDP of each of those countries, but would actually have an impact globally. And so we made the case that just as we advise very senior clients around the world on how to grow their businesses, it was just as essential to target female entrepreneurs. For many years, there had been a lot of good work done in the microfinance platform, but that was really at a level of, you know, the highest loan there is a couple $100s. And we saw a missing middle of small and medium-sized enterprises led by women that could actually create dozens and hundreds of jobs if they were empowered with business education and capital. And so it was through our 10,000 Women initiative that we were actually able to measure, very, very important. If you can't measure it, you're definitely not going to be able to attract further investment. And when we were independently assessed by a couple of organizations, we were able to show that the women that graduated from 10,000 Women had increased their revenues by 80%, had created new jobs. 60% of them had created net new jobs, and in very diverse economies, from Brazil to China to Rwanda to Egypt to Afghanistan. And when you're able to show that data, then you actually do get calls for co-investment. And it goes back to your point about public, private, and nonprofit sector. We actually got a call from Jim Kim at the World Bank, who was very focused on women's empowerment as a central solution to many global development challenges. And he started talking to us about how we could scale this initiative. And we actually started the first ever financing fund, a facility that provides capital. Now, and this facility will provide 100,000 women with capital. We took our initial grant, $50 million. The World Bank has put in now $300 million. We were very proud that last year President Obama invested $100 million through OPIC. And so you really start to see each sector that's very focused on one common mission, which is the belief that women's empowerment is no longer a justice issue alone or a human rights issue. It really is smart economics for around the world. And so that's why I think we were able to attract partners from each of the sectors. And something else that's very, very important, what Bea said, and I know they do this so well, they're best in class. When you're operating in these countries, the most unsmart thing to do is to come in and say, hi, we're Coca-Cola, we're Goldman Sachs, we're here to solve your problems. But rather, when you very humbly go into these countries and find the most respected local nonprofits, in our case, the most respected academic institutions, the most respected local officials, and work with them to develop what is a customized approach country by country, you get a lot further.
Yes, I think that's where Dina and I run into each other more, is outside of the country.
Yes.
And it's usually sitting around the table asking the local communities or NGOs, what is the local issue here that we can maybe be a part of the solution?
Yes.
And that's been a really great avenue to start the dialogue, because then you're not solving a problem that doesn't exist or a problem they don't want you to solve. And but that's one of the lessons learned, right?
It is very much one of the lessons
You
learned.
have to have the community buy-in. I think you're also something that's coming up is addressing one problem or what might be a goal for you, where it's a win-win for you. There is a halo effect where you're checking the box on many other problems that maybe you didn't know were connected to that. If partnering is so important on the community level, how do you mitigate the risk? I know from a corporate point of view and also from an investment point of view, you know, operating on a global scale, you're in emerging market economies, not all local governments are created equal, you have problems of if not extreme poverty, you have corruption, you have violence.
Yes.
How do you mitigate that when you're looking to partner?
You know, we found that you really do have to listen. You have to start and listen, and even when you think you've listened enough, you haven't. And that means listening to first civil society, the local community leaders, sitting side by side with the NGOs, with the government. You really do need to hear from the people. And that's where we've gotten some clear insight, because when we started our Women's Economic Empowerment Program, what we found is that if we didn't actually go in and speak to some of the male community leaders first, we were not going to be able to empower the women, and actually we could inadvertently put safety at harm. And so we said, well, how do we actually do this? And we found one size does not fit all. And we share some lessons learned. So we had to go in and really figure that out, but it was really deeply listening and putting ourselves sort of on the back burner first and saying, if we really want to help, and if our mission is to help communities thrive and leave a stronger legacy after, we build the program, how do we do that? And how can we make sure that we're welcomed in and that the program lasts even if our funding stopped? And that was one of the biggest things, but we also found that working with the government, because the governments do change, there's also, a government in Rwanda is going to be different from a government in Cape Town, different from a government in Delhi. So it just really getting to the local ministers and having the dialogue as to where are they putting their emphasis and what are they seeing in the community. And then setting goals together and understanding, it's almost like I hate to say it, a corporate role sort chart, so a RACI chart, if anyone knows what one of those are. But really sitting down and saying, okay, what are each one of our objectives? Who has the capability to deliver on it? Do we have any gaps? And then what's the metric for each one of us? And how does that come together? And that's how we mitigate some of the risk, because we know that if we're having that dialogue and we're taking the time, and I hate to say it, it's not going to happen over a telephone call. It's face to face. If you're really taking that time, now you've invested emotionally, not just financially, and so has everyone else sitting at that table. And at the end of the day, I think the general in here said people matter, and that's true. People matter, and if you put people first, you can really start to make a difference with your business. And then your business benefits too, is what we've found.
And you're building relationships. I'm curious, I can understand the conversation about the immediate impact on the bottom line for Coke when you're talking about water, when you're talking about sustainable agriculture. Was it a tougher sell when you were talking about women?
Yes, a lot of people thought it was the soft, squishy side, to be honest. And I don't know, Dina, if you went through this as well, but a lot of people said, oh, well, that's nice. It sounds like a nice thing to do. And I think some people, frankly, out of fear, were afraid to say, how is this important to the business? And so knowing you can read a room, right? So you could sense that they clearly understood water, they understood climate, we have operational equipment, we have trucks on the street, refrigerators, but the women's piece. And so reminding people that, well, women are over 70% of our purchasers. They matter to our business, and they choose if your products are in the home or not. They also, and you said it very well, they're a $12 trillion opportunity to this economy. It's a larger group. If you took China and India, combine them, it's a larger population. And starting to build the business case and the data, and then reminding people about the data was what happens in the local community, using UN Women. So UN Women is one of our local partnerships. They helped us get into the definitions, and PwC helped us early on as well, to say, well, how are we going to define economic empowerment, and how is it relevant to the business? And so we made a choice, which was to not fund it out of our foundation. We fund it out of the business, and it's across our value chain. So when we say we're going to empower economically 5 million women by 2020, we look at the farmers who are producing the mangoes for our juice business, all the way through to the recyclers. And we look at everything from ingredients to manufacturing to distribution. One story of one lady, just to show you how important it was to our business, but also important to her, was a lady named Regina in Rosemary, because Regina's one in Brazil, but Rosemary in Nairobi. And Rosemary's husband had left her. She had equipment and product, and the Coke bottler came in and said, we have this program called 5x20. We can teach you and train you if you're interested, because she had no other way to make a living. Well, Rosemary said, I want to do this. Well, she learned how to distribute our products. Her husband, mind you, was number 37 out of our 37 distributors in Nairobi. She's number 2. And guess what? She now is the second largest distributor in Nairobi, making a lot of money, bought her first home, employs other women. She chose to employ other women versus other men. And she's driving the scale of this business beyond territories that even I think we thought were possible. And she's teaching and training other women. And so that's one business case. When I take it to, an area in India, I sit down with them and I say, well, if you're not sure if this is important to the business, let me show you this business case with Rosemary, who's now the second largest distributor. So I think that's good for our business, even if it's good for her too. And then I show them the other case of this lady named Preeti, who's in a region in India, who has solar power coolers, who's generated incremental revenue and more Coca-Cola sales because of the solar powered cooler and driving revenues for her own business. Or Rosemary, or Regina, who's in Brazil in the favela, who's cleaning up the waste and working with recyclers now, over 700, when she started with a business of less than 10 women. So it's not, once you get into the facts and the data, it's not as hard of a sell, but you will still find people who maybe are resistant or reluctant because they also wonder, will men be displaced?
Right.
And what will happen to this other, there's some fear in that. And so we have to sit down and have those education conversations around, we're not trying to displace anyone. We're actually trying to provide opportunity for communities to thrive, back to what Dina said earlier.
And Dina, do you find that as well? For all the success, the early seed money is still coming from what I would consider, multinational organizations. Do you think there is a pathway from these early examples to get actual private money, capital, pension fund money into these type of projects? And do you need new vehicles to do that?
Well, it's interesting that you say pension funds. Just today, we sent out a press release, that same facility that's managed by the IFC that we've raised this capital for. We've now raised $30 million from a pension fund in Sweden, AP2, that you may be familiar with. And it's the reason is they actually want to diversify their portfolio, and they're very interested in having a percentage of it invested in ESG type investments. And in fact, in some parts of Europe, there's an interesting particular focus on women's empowerment programs. And when Bea was talking about how you make this case, I mean, here's a pension fund that looks at these investments in a very black and white fashion, and they want to make sure they're going to get a return on their investment. And the premise of the facility is that there is this enormous untapped market of female borrowers in many countries around the world, and access to capital just did not exist for those borrowers. And those borrowers, from a demand perspective, we're not going into the banks and asking for loans. And so what we've really done is incentivize these local banking institutions to acquire risk-sharing facilities, have credit lines from the facility, interest rate rebates, and so it's really an incentive, and the only restriction is those loans actually have to go to female borrowers. And what we've seen is, numbers are the best examples. These banks are seeing that there's a whole new market of female entrepreneurs. They're a very smart bet if you want your money returned. They're recycling that capital. They're growing their businesses. So when people talk about it, is this the soft side? As a data-driven firm, we have a lot of data that we can show. Everything that started from the first piece of research on this issue, Womenomics, which was authored by our chief economist in Japan, which has now become really the foundation for Abe's policy framework in Japan, his domestic policy and growth plan. So I think that if you talk about it as a nice thing to do, or a worthy investment, you're really giving it short shrift. This is really a smart investment if you care about growth. And certainly we could make the case why in each of our institutions it's really critical, and really more critical than ever. I think that we're still looking at many countries that do not have enough of an economic growth plan. I'll just give you one country which I know has a lot of issues going on, Brazil. We actually did a report called Giving Credit Where Credit is Due. We tried to quantify the access to capital gap for female entrepreneurs. So how much capital would actually be borrowed for growth and working capital if it existed? And we found that there's a $300 billion gap. And if that gap were met in the BRICS and next 11 countries, so in those emerging economies, if you were able to provide that access to capital, per capita income in those countries would grow on average by 14%. But in a country like Brazil, it would grow by 27%. So that's very meaningful for these economies.
When you talk about, I think this circles back to the importance of partnering locally within communities. Something I hear from women entrepreneurs all the time, young women trying to start businesses in some of these places, is that they have no credit card. They have none of the funding, the early seed funding that would be not even a thought for someone, especially in a developed market. Hard enough in a landscape and emerging, maybe doesn't have all the funding available for entrepreneurs. No credit card. One woman in Iran was sitting across with business partners who wouldn't look at her, or wouldn't even talk to her, would only talk to her father, who was nice enough to join her in the room because of this. Someone else couldn't get a refrigerator delivered because they wouldn't sign it off to her because they didn't believe she ran the company. There's incredible cultural barriers that need to be overcome in this particular part that maybe you don't find with water or climate financing. Can community partnerships help bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I believe they can, and what we have found is, a lot of the reason why we go in with the community is also because we employ 700,000 system-wide employees. We produce locally, we manufacture locally, we distribute locally. So the communities typically are employees. I mean, in Africa, we're the largest private employer. So what we have found is that those barriers are real and they exist, and cultural barriers take time to overcome, but it's through education and through a lot of conversation, and we rely heavily on the local NGOs and the local ministers to work with us to have that dialogue. But then, frankly, there's some times where you're not successful in that conversation, and it doesn't mean you give up, but there's also a window of time where you say, okay, well, you know what? Let me just let it sit here for a while, and let me let the NGOs and the communities have these conversations, and then we'll come back when they're ready. Because we've also found that if we push it too soon, then it doesn't gain traction, and it's, here comes Coke saying what's good for us versus really listening. And that's where we have to constantly remind ourselves, and you probably, Dina, are in the same situation. You see the opportunity and you want to help, but also sometimes good work and good intentions can have unintended consequences. And those barriers are really difficult to overcome, but we found generationally through the education process, by having the men and the women in the room together, having families come together, and having experts talk about the benefit to the business and the benefit to them personally, and how it can better their own personal situations and communities, it does start to change the dialogue.
Dina, is there a bias toward large multinational companies coming in on these issues, whether we're talking about any of the issues that have been brought up today, not just women, but also climate, water?
Well, obviously because of our platforms, because of the fact that we do business in so many countries around the world, we really have to be addressing these issues, and we see them as opportunities. But I think sort of from a macro perspective, this whole idea of sustainability, corporate social responsibility, traditional philanthropy, I think we're really in real time seeing a seismic shift. That, gone are the days that companies, large or small, are really, giving small grants to a number of different organizations that aren't even focused on the same issue set. I think whether it's a global multinational organization or a small enterprise, even some of the Silicon Valley, companies that are very young in their tenures, but they really are starting to embed a sense of social responsibility, social impact from the very beginning. And there's a few reasons why that's really important. The first is if you want to recruit and retain the best people, especially this millennial generation, is really asking about the values of the institution before they're joining and if they want to stay. A number that might surprise many of you is that 65% of the population of Goldman Sachs right now is millennial. So 65% of the nearly 30,000 people around the world that work at Goldman Sachs are under the age of 30. So that's really pushed us in a very positive way to really be thinking about the kind of institution that attracts those young men and women and keeps them. So that's really a business imperative, whether you're a very large corporation or a small enterprise. And I think this shift, again, from traditional philanthropy to impact investing, which is really, I think, defined by aligning with your business mission, holding yourself accountable as an institution to measurable change, transparently releasing the results so that people can really see that you actually helped create jobs, empower women, whatever the initiative is, make sure focus on environmental issues. And then, of course, then you actually can see a return. In multiple ways, you can define that return, but certainly we've actually been able to see it as using our capital to catalyze other capital, commercial capital, multilateral capital, public sector capital. So I think that we're certainly seeing a whole new generation of companies that see this as really central to their business mission.
Yes, and I think a lot of companies are starting by writing their clear purpose, because there's a book that was written by Freya Williams who studied businesses and what was happening with their growth and stock price. And the companies who were purpose-driven and how they grew their business, so Tesla is an example of that, their stock price was 11.7% higher than the rest of the market. And they started to show that they grew $100 billion in revenues simply by being a purpose-driven business. So I think that that's also part of the shift, which is you're seeing the millennial generation is pulling forward, and it's an expectation. They're asking the questions when they are being recruited, and they only stay in these companies who are doing it, but also then it's smart business when you're seeing the returns that these businesses are driving. They're being rewarded.
They are, and investors have to be paying attention to that, Dina, if that's the case. Bea and I talked about this a little beforehand, but I'd like you both to weigh in on this. Because a lot of these things are early in their inception and you're learning as you go, who's best placed to provide the most transparent return on these investments and data? You're doing it, Dina, at Goldman based on the projects you have your hand in, but do we need more of it? Would that help the conversation? And who's best placed to provide that?
Well, I think even in our case, you have to have an independent entity assess these programs. And so, in our case, we had both the International Center for Research on Women and Babson College take the data, actually go into the field, interview the women, confirm that the data that we received was accurate, and do an assessment. And so, I do think that's a touchy subject, understandably, for many corporations, that are cautious about releasing that data. And we felt that, obviously we felt good about the results, but we also felt good about talking about what we didn't do very well, what lessons we learned, why certain countries just had some challenges that the data was not as strong, and why other countries outperformed our expectations. Because if you're really focused on impact and using these, I guess the best way to describe it is we really think about our institution as an innovation lab. We're really trying to test new models, new products that meet a market gap, to independently have those assessed. And if the data proves to be positive, then you will actually be able to catalyze co-investments. And I think that means definitionally the private sector is taking the riskier capital, right? Is investing the riskier capital, because public sector can't. I was in the public sector for a long time before coming to Goldman, and government just does not have the ability to to invest that kind of riskier capital. But I think that's a perfect role for each. The private sector testing models that may or may not work, transparently releasing the results, including the lessons learned, and then if it's successful, the government can actually scale those models.
Yeah, and I'll just to tag team off of Dina, what we found is that we were, with great intent, having a lot of our partners validate the information, but more through the NGO sector in the beginning. And when we started to shift to put more discipline around this, we said we really need independent parties. We don't want the implementation partner who's working with us on water to also be the one who validates the data, because there's a conflict. And so we still use them as implementation partners, but we shifted to working with, at first, PwC, for example, on 5x20 to really understand definitions, and then E&Y because they assure our financial data. And we felt that that gave a stronger independence. They're already auditing our business. They're already looking at how we operate. And if this is core to our business, we wanted the same company to do that work. What we have found is that these companies are still building their capability. They're not subject matter experts, they're building it. And so we have to be patient and push ourselves and work together and report that data very publicly, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. And then, if it's bad or ugly, how are you going to improve it, and how are you going to course correct it? And so we're learning. We also learned that in the beginning we needed to reshape some of the definitions, because what we thought was success was not necessarily a strong enough definition for an accounting firm. And so we've had to put more rigor into the definition and go back and readjust some baselines.
But that's encouraging, because that's exactly what would happen in the world of startups, including the failure. If we've learned anything from Google's moonshot, we know that failing is a good thing. I want to take the opportunity to open it up to anyone who has questions before we continue the conversation. I don't know how we're supposed to do this, but I see your hand up. I think there's a microphone coming.
Thank you, Dina and Bea, for being with us here today and sharing your experiences. My name is Chris Calabi. I work at the Federal Reserve Bank here in New York. Both of you have talked about the importance of finding good local NGOs and local leaders to help you frame the problems appropriately and come up with an appropriate tailored solution for that particular community. What's the role of local governments or national governments, especially if they may have different policy priorities or laws or regulations that may make your collaboration difficult? And how do you reframe the problem for them?
I mean, I can start it. As you know, we operate in 207 countries, and so we're dealing at all levels of government. And sometimes you're right, sometimes we don't agree on necessarily what the objectives are, and so that's where we found the listening process is really important, and not being afraid to have the discussion. Because you're not always going to agree, and you don't always have to like each other, but if you can get to some sort of common place around what is the community issue that we both feel needs to be solved, and what can we bring to the table, and then how is it good for the government, good for the people, good for business, and good for the implementation partners. And that's where the real work starts. I mean, some people, say to me, gosh, but it takes so long to have that conversation. It does. If it's, and those are the worthwhile conversations, because we don't feel we should do it without the government's involvement. We feel that that is not the best place to start. We want the government to have the seat at the table, because at some point in time, it might actually drive a policy change that is better for that community. Or maybe it'll inform us that, we were working on the wrong things, and then we can course correct. So we have found that it's critical, and we have found that, at the very local level, it is dealing with local municipalities. We deal with a lot of mayors, for example, here in the United States, because they're looking at their zip codes and saying, well, what can I do here for this particular area? That's how detailed we have to get. We might have a global goal of replenish 100% of the water we use, but that's one community, one person impact at a time.
Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about our global investing, but we have a U.S. version of the program called 10,000 Small Businesses, which actually works with men and women business owners. We looked at what has happened over the last few years, and of course 80% of every new job created in the past 12 years in the United States was created by a small enterprise. And so we took the model that we'd been invested in globally and brought it to the United States, which provides business education and capital through CDFIs here in the U.S. To business owners across the country. And what we realized was that if you get it right in one or two cities, one of our co-chairs is Warren Buffett, and he actually said, start in one or two cities first and really test the model and make sure it's working, because then other cities will see the benefit. And so we did that. We started here in New York at LaGuardia Community College. We've now worked with 800 business owners. We're seeing extraordinary revenue growth, job creation, two very exciting numbers. One is that 75% of the business owners are actually doing business together, so it's creating a marketplace among the business owners. And then we're operating at community colleges. So the curriculum is delivered by community colleges, and we have found that in all these years that we've been running the program, we have a 99% graduation rate. So when other mayors saw these numbers, they were actually calling us and saying, why haven't you picked my city? And so that's where we very quickly scaled to many cities, because like Bea said, you want to be invited in. And in order, I think, to be invited in, you have to show why you're adding value. And again, the results really spoke for themselves. And so we think of, in every city where we're working, we really think of the mayor as the chairman of the initiative there, and the community college, the local institutions that we work with, like the National Urban League, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the NAACP. Many of these local organizations are actually nominating the businesses. So when you have that kind of personal investment, you really want the program to succeed. And so again, it's absolutely a grassroots local approach.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you so much. Very inspiring. My name is Åsa. I'm the president of the Hunger Project, which is a non-for-profit working in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And we work with community-led development, so I must say I'm very happy to hear about the inclusion process and listening process, and would be interested in learning more about that. So what we see is not only listening, but putting people themselves in the lead is critical for sustainable change. What we struggle with, and I think we all, no matter what type of business we struggle with, are the metrics for the soft parts of it. So how do we measure women's empowerment, for instance? How do we measure when leadership has been unleashed? So I was curious to hear what type of metrics are you using for this type of development?
Well, that's a great question, and actually something that I omitted. We obviously invested in female entrepreneurs around the world because we saw the economic opportunity. But of course, we also saw something else, which is a double bottom line investment. Women take 90% of their income and reinvest it into the community. And so women are taking whatever income they have, and suddenly you're finding a more educated community, a healthier community all across the world. And in fact, if you look at the first set of Millennium Development Goals, whether it was the universal education, a maternal mortality, trying to address HIV, AIDS, malaria, central to the solution are women and girls because they are the ones that are most affected. And so it really, we felt, was, again, the best investment because economies grow, jobs are created, but communities thrive much more effectively. But it was harder to quantify that paying it forward, the activities that women did once they were economically independent. And so it was the International Center for Research on Women who said, why don't we, when we actually interview the women as part of the research, ask what they've been doing. And we had one metric that was very successful. Women graduating from 10,000 women were actually mentoring at least 8 other women. And in many cases, there were hundreds of women. And so we could actually use at least one quantifiable metric to say that you can actually measure that women pay it forward. No offense to the men, but unfortunately the data shows that men are spending their income elsewhere. But in this case, we actually were able to quantify that and not just talk about it anecdotally, although we had many, many lovely stories. It was really important to actually create a metric around it.
And we took also an additional approach. So we were looking at economically empowering, because when we first started, we used the word just empower, and we found that was very hard to measure, and it did feel softer. Right. But we also, in our Brazil community, we have a program called Colectivo, and it has 7 different components. And we said, well, what would it be like if we started to look at, did self-esteem increase as a result of this? And if their self-esteem increased, were they also then able to either employ more people or have a higher income for themselves? And so we've started to measure and track, and we saw a 30% increase, and it's, of course, this is all self-reported data. The women are giving you they're answering a set of questions, and then that comes out with a score. But they were saying that their self-esteem was higher, they felt more confident. And it was interesting because those women within that study group, we also saw an increase in their income. Now that's one small research study that we did in Brazil around the Colectivo project, but we're looking at how do you scale that? And is that something that we should be looking at across the board around self-esteem? But that one is a little bit of a softer metric. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Dave Lipsky from Samsung. How do you engage and involve your employees in your sustainability efforts?
So that was one of our lessons learned. We obviously from the very beginning, and again, why it's important to select initiatives that your employee base have the knowledge and expertise to participate in. And again, in our case, it was helping entrepreneurs grow their businesses. And obviously in your case, again, they had sort of the talent and the experience. But we knew that people would want to work with these entrepreneurs. And in our case, if we were working in Brazil, in China, in many places where we had offices, our people could actually serve as business advisors. And so we made it quite easy. We created a whole program around reviewing business plans, selecting some of the business women, serving as business advisors. And we knew there'd be a lot of interest, but we did not realize how much. And so very quickly, as we started to scale the program and to reach 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, we found that we had hundreds of people at Goldman Sachs on waiting lists who really wanted to be engaged, particularly in those countries. But we even had a virtual application where you could do advising. And so we had really underestimated. And so we had to very quickly figure out how to, you probably did too, how to create teams, because people, as we said earlier, are really interested in being part of these initiatives. And if your employees aren't part of it, that's a huge missed opportunity, and in fact can be detrimental if they don't have an avenue into working on these initiatives.
Well, and so we have similar lessons learned, and so we formalized a program called Coca-Cola Ambassadors. And our employees can sign up, they can learn more about what we're doing, they can also engage. And one example of where they've engaged is our partnership with the Global Fund, where a lot of people actually misunderstand the program. They think that we use our trucks to distribute vaccines. What we actually do is work with the medical community centers there and the ministers of health to help train the individuals around how to distribute the vaccines, how to make sure that it doesn't get spoiled along the chain, and then how do you fix the refrigeration equipment if it breaks down in a very rural, off-the-grid location. Because as you know, once your refrigeration breaks, those vaccines are worthless and you can't give them, so you have a lot of spoilage. Well, so it was our folks within our operations, the folks who fix, the Coke refrigerator or the trucks, who went around and started teaching and training and building the capability, and are also always on call. They're also part of that local community, so they feel really proud of the work that they're able to do to help their fellow community, partners, and at the same time, they go home and they're very proud to tell their children what they did at work that day, because what they did is maybe fixed, a refrigerator, or taught someone how to fix a refrigerator in case they weren't there, that would save the lives of X number of kids through these vaccines that were now available. And so we have found that using the capability of our business to teach capability to others, so that way it would sustain itself, that was a way that our employees really started to engage with the programs. They wanted to learn more, they wanted to read more, but they also wanted to participate and play an active role.
I think there's someone back there.
Hi, my name is Jenny Davis. I work at the Clinton Foundation. President Clinton often tells us that our ultimate goal is to work ourselves out of a job. And a lot of times that could mean developing a social enterprise that generates a profit that can then be reinvested in self-sustainable, or engaging the private sector and getting beverage companies to reduce the number of calories shipped to schools. I think these are really high impact methods that are important for both scalability and self-sustainability. Unfortunately, not everyone sees it that way. So my question is, how can we get the general public to better understand that aligning business goals with social goals is a good thing?
Yeah. I would agree with President Clinton that it is our jobs to work ourselves out of jobs. I walk around Coca-Cola and some people think I'm nuts, and I say, I can't wait for the day that I get called in and they say you're no longer necessary, because that means that, I believe that then it's so embedded into the business and it's just becomes a part of how we operate. And you no longer need to have someone who is sort of overseeing it and having to push and drive that change, because it's being driven on its own through the rewards and metrics and everything that takes place. So I agree with that. I believe that civil society and people actually do have good intent and want to help. The biggest challenge that I think we have found is that sometimes they just don't know how. And so they're not sure necessarily, well, how can I participate? So I hear about Coca-Cola's 5x20 program empowering women. That's nice, but how can I get involved to work with a company like that to do something? And so right now, one of our lessons learned is, how do you engage the broader public in this journey and to give them a way to tap into their skills and drive, options for them around the how. So I actually think that more people are probably there than it might feel like it. I just think that a lot of times what we found in our research when we talk to the public is that, they want to move from intention to action. They just don't know necessarily where to engage. And if you give them an avenue on where to engage, they absolutely participate. And we found that with a lot of our local programs, when we go in and we invite the communities in to work with us, and they do, and they step up.
I think with the way we think about working ourselves out of a job is what I was referring to earlier, which is thinking about where our investment in the cycle makes the most sense. And so in the few initiatives we've discussed today, it was really the seed capital, the implementing, the measuring, 2 new job creation models that also, we believed had, in certainly the case of 10,000 Women, global development advantages as well. And so now we feel like we sort of incubated 10,000 Women, and now it's really being sustained with other capital. And so the idea that you're kind of creating models, incubating new programs, and ultimately the market will decide if these models should, be scaled up. And so we've seen in 2 cases, at least, the market is taking our models and sustaining them and growing them and scaling them. And the other thing I think we think about is there's a clear metric when businesses evaluate this, and is there shareholder value? Do the shareholders think these initiatives are valuable? And again, I think if you're a smart shareholder, you want your company to be recruiting and retaining the best people. You want your company to be thinking about how it uses its talent, its resources, to really drive positive change around the world, whether it's in your day job, building markets, creating products, but also in a period of time where I think the private sector has a huge responsibility, working alongside of government and the public sector, to try to drive the change that is needed in many places around the world using its talent and resources. So I think that shareholders are beginning to really value this, and even investment funds, as we were referencing earlier, really are changing this whole dynamic that is urging percentage of the portfolio to be invested in ESG-related activities.
Well, perfect. I think we're out of time, so everyone's timing was marvelous. Thank all of you, and also, of course, to Bea and Dina for being such fantastic panelists today. And I believe there are some drinks and refreshments somewhere for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie.